There are towns in this country where the streetlights still switch on at dusk, humming to life over roads that no car has driven in years. There are houses standing furnished and locked, curtains hanging in the windows, waiting for families who packed up and drove away and never came back. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and yet more than 4/5 of its people are pressed into a thin band near the American border, leaving a vast interior dotted with places that were built with confidence and emptied without ceremony. Some of these towns held 5,000 people once. A few of them can be bought today, the whole town, for less than the price of a modest house in Toronto. Why did everybody leave, and why will nobody go back? Hit subscribe. I promise this is worth your time. Number 10. Kitsault, British Columbia, on the north coast near the head of a long fjord called Alice Arm, roughly 140 kilometers north of Prince Rupert. Picture a complete modern town, built all at once at the end of the 1970s to serve a molybdenum mine, with apartment blocks, single-family homes, a shopping mall, a hospital, a library, a swimming pool, and a recreation center, all of it wired and plumbed and painted. The mining company Amax spent roughly $43 million raising it out of the wilderness, and about 1,200 people moved in. The price of molybdenum then collapsed on the world market, and 18 months after the first families arrived, in 1983, every single one of them was gone. What makes Kitsault extraordinary is that it was never torn down or looted. A later owner bought the entire town and has kept the power running and the lawns mown for decades. Walk its streets today, and the lights come on at night over empty crescents, the buildings intact, the whole place preserved like a photograph of a moment that ended before it began. There is a strange, unsettling completeness to it. The shelves in the mall still have their fittings. The gymnasium floor is still varnished. The lawns are mown by a skeleton crew. The roads are plowed in winter. And a full town of streets and homes stands ready for a population that never came and never will. Nobody lives there. You cannot casually buy a house, because one man owns all of them, and the town simply waits, furnished and silent, at the head of its cold northern fjord, for a future that keeps not arriving. Number 9. Ocean Falls, British Columbia, tucked into a steep inlet on the central coast where there is no road in at all, only a boat or a seaplane, and the ferry that runs from Bella Coola, some 88 kilometers away. This was a pulp and paper town, born around a mill that started running in 1912, and at its height, around 1950, roughly 3,500 people lived here, in a place so wet that the local high school sports team called themselves the Rain People. The mill changed hands, faltered, was propped up by the provincial government, and finally shut for good in 1980. The company houses came down, the workers scattered, and the population fell to a scattering of holdouts. Today, somewhere between 35 and 60 people live here year-round, rattling around the shell of a town built for 100 times their number. The old mill rusts against the rain. A huge dam holds back the lake above, and the main street stands mostly empty, its buildings sagging under the endless damp. This is one of the wettest inhabited places in North America, drenched by well over 4 meters of rain in a year, and the moss and the moisture are steadily reclaiming everything the people left behind. Reach it by water on a gray afternoon, and the scale of the abandonment is overwhelming. Apartment blocks with the forest growing through their windows, a swimming pool full of leaves, a hotel called the Martin Inn standing dark and enormous above the inlet, and the rain coming down as it always has, on almost no one at all. The handful who remain speak of a town that once had cinemas and a bowling alley, and the fastest swimmers in the province, all of it dissolved back into the rainforest within a generation. Number 8. Uranium City, Saskatchewan, pressed against the north shore of Lake Athabasca, in the far northwest of the province, hundreds of kilometers from any highway, and reachable in practice only by air. The town was thrown up in 1952, around the uranium mines of the El Dorado Company, and through the boom of the mid-50s, it was the fastest-growing community in Saskatchewan, a place that expected to house thousands, and briefly did, with schools, a modern hospital, and a curling rink dropped onto the Precambrian rock. Everything depended on a single buyer of uranium and a single company to dig it. When El Dorado announced in 1982 that the main mine would close, the collapse was almost instant. A town of roughly 2,500 people at the end of 1981 had fallen to around 200 by 1986. The population never recovered, and only a few dozen people remain. Drive, or rather fly, into Uranium City today, and you find a skeleton, the enormous Candu High School, built to hold hundreds of students, standing cavernous and nearly empty, whole subdivisions swallowed by the bush, foundations of vanished houses scattered through the trees, and a handful of residents keeping the lights on in a place the rest of the country forgot the moment the ore stopped mattering. A further blow came in 2003, when the regional hospital services were moved away to Stony Rapids, stripping the town of one more reason to hold on. In winter, the sun barely climbs above the black spruce. The temperature sits far below -30, and the few who stay measure the distance to the rest of Saskatchewan not in kilometers, but in the cost and the weather of the next flight out. Number 7. Pine Point in the Northwest Territories, on the south shore of Great Slave Lake. This one is the purest expression of the whole pattern, because Pine Point is not a ruin, it is an absence. The mining company Cominco built the town from nothing in 1962 to work a rich body of lead and zinc, and by 1976 it had reached a peak of 1,915 people, with paved streets, a school, a shopping center, and neat rows of family homes. The mine closed in 1987, and rather than leave the town to rot, the company and the government dismantled it entirely in 1988. Every building was demolished or hauled away. What remains today, out on the flat land above the lake, is the ghost of a street grid, curbs and sidewalks and driveways leading to bare gravel pads where houses used to be, the roads still named, the lampposts sometimes still standing, and nothing else. A town of nearly 2,000 people was formally dissolved in 1996 and erased so thoroughly that a visitor drives through what looks like an abandoned road map printed onto the tundra. Wander the grid on foot and the details are heartbreaking in their ordinariness. A crescent that once curved past a dozen family homes, a cul-de-sac where children must have ridden their bikes, a driveway leading to nothing at all. The willows and the fireweed push up through the cracks in the asphalt, and the great flat lake stretches beyond, indifferent. There are no houses to buy in Pine Point. There is only the shape of where they were. Subscribe to show that these videos actually matter and make a difference. Number 6. Cassiar, British Columbia, high in the remote northwest of the province near the Yukon border, a place where the winters are long and hard, and the nearest anything is a very long drive away. Cassiar was an asbestos town, founded in 1952 after the discovery of a rich seam of the fiber, and by the 1970s, about 1,500 people lived there, with 2 schools, 2 churches, a hospital, a theater, a swimming pool, and a hockey rink. Asbestos, once a miracle material, became a poison the world no longer wanted, and as demand collapsed and the underground operation grew too costly, the company shut everything down in 1992. What happened next was stark. Most of the town was auctioned off, house by house, the buildings trucked away down the highway, and what could not be sold was bulldozed and burned to the ground. The hockey arena caved in under the snow in 2008. The church collapsed in 2015. Drive the long gravel approach today, and you find scattered foundations, a lonely ore tram line still strung against the mountainside, 4 battered apartment blocks kept for the crews who monitor the site, and a silence so complete that former residents who return say the hardest part is standing where their house used to be and finding only grass. Those former residents keep in touch across the decades and gather at reunions, still calling Cassiar the best place they ever lived, mourning a town that was not so much abandoned as disassembled and driven away, board by board, down the highway and out of existence. A house in Cassiar cannot be priced, because the town that held it was quite literally carried away. Number 5. Val-Jalbert, Quebec, in the Lac Saint-Jean region, at the foot of a tall waterfall called the Ouiachiouan. This is one of the oldest ghost towns on our list, and one of the best preserved in the whole country. A businessman named Damasse Jalbert built a pulp mill here in 1901, harnessing the falls to grind wood into pulp, and a tidy company village grew up around it, with rows of workers' houses, a general store, a school, and a convent, all owned by the company. The village lived and died by a single product, mechanical pulp, and when the market for it fell away, the mill closed in 1927. The company ordered the houses boarded up, and by 1929, the priest and the nuns had left, and the village was empty. Because it was abandoned so completely and so early, and later protected as a heritage site, more than 70 of its original buildings still stand, weathered and gray beneath the falls. Nobody lives in Val Jalbert. Walk its wooden sidewalks and you are walking through a town frozen in the moment the mill whistle fell silent, the empty houses leaning into the mist thrown up by the water that once powered them, the paint long gone from the clapboard, the general store's shelves still standing in the gloom. It is a warning wrapped in beauty, a reminder that Canada was building company towns tied to a single fragile product a full century ago, and watching them die exactly the same way then as it does now. Number 4. Bankhead, Alberta, and this one sits in a place that will surprise you. High in the mountains just above the resort town of Banff, inside what is now a national park. In the first years of the 20th century, the Canadian Pacific Railway sank a coal mine into Cascade Mountain and built a company town called Bankhead to house the miners who dug the hard anthracite coal that fired its locomotives. At its peak, around 1,000 people lived here, in a community with electric lights and a proper main street, at a time when much of the country still burned wood and oil lamps. Labor disputes, the difficult nature of the coal seam, and shifting markets brought it down, and the mine closed in 1922 after barely 20 years, earning Bankhead the nickname the 20-year town. The buildings were not left to decay. Many were physically lifted and carted down the mountain to Banff and Canmore, where some of them still stand as houses today. Because the site lies within a national park, nothing was ever built there again. Wander the interpretive trails now, and you find crumbling concrete foundations, a rusting mine transformer, the old lamp house standing alone, and the strange sight of ornamental lilac bushes, still flowering each spring around the ghosts of gardens whose owners left a century ago. Millions of tourists pass through Banff every year, chasing the mountains and the turquoise lakes, and almost none of them know that a coal town of 1,000 souls once burned its lamps a few kilometers up the road, or that some of the cottages they drive past in Banff itself were carried down whole from a place that no longer exists. Number 3. Little Bay Islands, Newfoundland, a fishing outport on Notre Dame Bay, reachable only by a ferry that no longer runs. For nearly 2 centuries, this was a cod fishing and processing community, one of hundreds of tiny outports scattered along the Newfoundland coast, where families made their whole lives from the sea. The Great Cod Moratorium of 1992, which shut down the northern cod fishery to save it from total collapse, cut the heart out of the local economy, and when the crab processing plant closed in 2010, the working-age population drained away. What happened to Little Bay Islands is a distinctly Canadian ending. The provincial government has long run a resettlement program, offering to pay the residents of dying outports to leave so it can stop funding the ferry, the power, and the services. After years of failed votes, the last permanent residents, around 55 people, agreed unanimously to go, each household receiving somewhere between $250,000 and $270,000 to abandon their homes. The town officially ceased to exist on the 1st of January 2019, when the power to the island was cut and the ferry stopped running for good. The houses still stand along the rocky shore, painted in the bright reds and blues and yellows of the Newfoundland coast, some now used by former residents who come back only in the brief warmth of summer to keep a memory alive. The wharves are empty, the ferry slip is silent, the church and the school and the shop wait behind locked doors. It is a rare and strange thing to watch an entire community reach the collective decision that its 200 years are over, sign the papers, take the check and sail away, leaving behind a place too beautiful and too remote for anyone to want to keep. Number 2. Eniaux, British Columbia, on the remote north coast at the head of Observatory Inlet, a place so isolated that even in its heyday, you could only reach it by ship. Eniaux was a copper town, built by the Granby Company beginning in 1912 around a mine and an enormous smelter, and by 1914, almost 3,000 people lived here in a full industrial city with a hydroelectric dam, a company store, and rows of housing clinging to the steep, treeless slopes that the smelter's fumes had stripped bare. For 23 years, it poured out copper and gold and silver in staggering quantities. The Great Depression crushed the price of copper. The the company found itself sitting on a mountain of metal it could not sell, and in 1935, it closed the mine and walked away. Forest fires swept through the abandoned wooden town in the following years, and salvage crews stripped out the valuable steel and machinery. What remains today, reachable only by boat, is one of the largest and eeriest industrial ruins in Canada, the concrete skeleton of the smelter, the towering dam still holding back its lake, the slag heaps and the crumbling coke ovens, and the rubble of houses spread across a shoreline where a city of 3,000 once roared. The hillsides, poisoned bare by decades of sulfur fumes, are only slowly growing back. Boaters who anchor here describe an overwhelming stillness, broken only by the drip of water through the ruins and the cry of an eagle, a place where an entire industrial civilization rose and fell in a single human lifetime and then was swallowed whole by the coast. Number 1. Bradian, British Columbia, in the mountains of the Bridge River Valley northwest of Whistler, near the old gold mining center of Bralorne. Bradian was built in the 1930s as a residential town site for the workers of the rich Bralorne and Pioneer gold mines, and through the boom years, it held a comfortable community of neat homes in one of the most productive gold districts the province ever knew. When the major mines wound down and finally closed in the early 1970s, the reason for Bradian evaporated, and its residents left. The town's strangest chapter came decades later, when the entire place, roughly 24 buildings on a parcel of mountain land, was put up for sale as a single lot for just under $1 million. A whole abandoned town offered to any buyer with the money and the imagination. It changed hands more than once. Plans to revive it as a resort or a retreat came and went, and it stands there still, a cluster of empty houses among the peaks, the paint peeling, the gardens gone wild, the mountain snow piling against porches that no one clears. Reach it at the end of a winding gravel road, more than 100 kilometers of switchbacks from the nearest highway, and the silence of the high valley presses in from every side. Here, at last, is the pattern in its final form, a town that a fortune in gold conjured out of the mountains, and that the end of the gold offered back to the world, whole and intact, for less than the price of a single house in the city those miners' grandchildren fled to. To understand why these 10 towns stand empty, you have to understand the pattern that built them and the pattern that killed them, because it is nearly always the same pattern wearing different clothes. Canada, for most of its modern history, has been a country that reaches into remote and hostile places to pull something valuable out of the ground or the water, and around that valuable thing it raises a town almost overnight. The company arrives first, then the workers, then the families, then the school and the arena and the church. And for a decade or two, the arrangement feels like permanence. What almost no one living in those bright new streets wanted to admit was that the town was never really theirs. It belonged to a balance sheet. It existed to serve a mine, a mill, a smelter, a fishery, or a railway, and the moment that single reason to exist stopped paying, the entire logic of the place collapsed. The industries that drew people into the Canadian wilderness were the great extractive engines of the 19th and 20th centuries. Coal, dug from the mountains to fire the locomotives and the furnaces. Copper and gold and silver, chased into the rock of British Columbia and northern Ontario and the Yukon. Iron and lead and zinc, hauled out of the north by rail lines laid across 1,000 kilometers of muskeg. Timber, felled and pulped into the newsprint that the whole continent once read its morning news on. Asbestos and uranium and molybdenum, minerals most people had never heard of, mined in places most people will never see. And along the coasts, the fisheries, the cod and the salmon that fed entire villages for 200 years. Each of these industries carried people into the emptiness, and each of them, in its turn, let them fall. The killing blows came in familiar forms. A vein of ore runs out, because no deposit lasts forever. A distant market shifts, and a metal that was precious one year is worthless the next. A machine replaces the 100 men a mine or a mill once needed. A government or a company sits in a boardroom far away and does the cold arithmetic and decides that a remote town is no longer worth the cost of keeping alive. When those forces landed, the response was brutal and fast. A company that owned the houses and the power plant and the only road out could simply decide to leave, and a town of thousands could shrink to a handful of holdouts inside a single year. Where did all of these people go? The answer is written into the growth of Canada's cities, because the emptying of the resource towns and the swelling of the metropolitan south are two halves of the same story. Families that had built their whole lives around a mine in the bush moved to Prince George, to Edmonton, to Sudbury, to Vancouver, to Halifax, wherever a paycheck did not depend on the price of a single metal. The young always left first, chasing university and a wider world. And once, a critical number of them had gone, the decline fed on itself. A young person weighing whether to stay looks around at who has already left. When the doctor moves away, the next family thinks harder about the school. When the school closes, the family after that simply packs the truck. Study after study of Canadian rural depopulation shows the same grim mechanics. These regions lose far more people to their own big cities than they ever draw back from anywhere, and once a town tips past a certain point, the unraveling is almost impossible to stop. Each closed store makes the next closure more likely, until the only people left are the ones too old, too rooted, or too stubborn to go. A place with no reason to exist beyond the thing in the ground empties the moment the thing in the ground is gone. Which brings us to the question that hangs over every one of these 10 places. If you can buy an entire town for less than the price of a city condominium, and if in some of these regions a habitable house sells for a few $1,000s, why does almost nobody take the bargain? Why do these towns stay empty even though the price of moving in has fallen to almost nothing? The answer is that the price on the sign was never the real cost of living there. Consider the winter, which across most of these places is not an inconvenience but an adversary. In the northern interior, the cold settles below -25 degrees for months at a stretch, and in the far north it plunges past -40, with a wind that freezes exposed skin in minutes. Heating a drafty old house through a season like that burns thousands of dollars in fuel oil or propane every single year, and in the remote places that fuel must be trucked hundreds of kilometers, arriving with a delivery charge that reflects every one of those kilometers. Consider the isolation. Many of these towns sit hundreds of kilometers from the nearest hospital with a specialist, down a single road that closes in a blizzard, or down no road at all. A medical emergency can mean waiting for an air ambulance and hoping the weather holds long enough for it to land. A woman expecting a baby may have to leave her own home weeks early and wait it out in a city hundreds of kilometers away, because there is no one nearby who can safely deliver the child. The things city dwellers take entirely for granted, a walk-in clinic, a pharmacy open late, an ambulance 20 minutes out, simply do not exist here, and their absence is not an abstraction, but a daily calculation about risk. Consider the services that were never there or have quietly vanished. When a town empties, the grocery store closes, the pharmacy shuts, the bank branch pulls out, and the school consolidates into a district too far away to reach. A family that moves into a cheap house discovers that the nearest supermarket is an hour's drive, that there is no doctor, no dentist, and no work of any kind within reach. Consider the freight. Everything ordered to a remote address arrives with a shipping charge that can rival the price of the thing itself, when a company will ship there at all. Consider the internet, thin or missing across huge stretches of the north and the interior, which strangles the one modern hope that a person might earn a city wage from a cheap house in the bush. Run the true numbers and the bargain dissolves in your hands. The house may need a furnace or a roof that no contractor will drive 4 hours to install without a fee that dwarfs the purchase price. The water line may freeze and split every second January. The insurance, if a company will write it at all, so far from a fire hall, costs a premium. The house was the only part of the whole equation that was ever cheap. There is one more thing the low price hides, and it is the sheer scale of the distances. In the crowded south of the country, a cheap house in a struggling town is still an hour from a city, a hospital, an airport, a life to fall back on. In the places on this list, the distances are of a different order entirely. The nearest real hospital might be 400 kilometers away. The nearest city with a proper choice of jobs might be 600 or 700. Between the towns, there is often nothing at all. No next village a short drive over, no cluster of farms, no highway strip of services, only the forest and the rock and the long empty road, or the cold gray water and no road whatsoever. A person who buys the cheap house is not moving to a quiet town. They are moving to an island in an ocean of wilderness, and every single thing they need that the town does not provide must be hauled across that ocean at their own expense. Beneath all of the practical arithmetic lies the heaviest weight of all, which is the psychology of settling in a place that everyone else has already chosen to leave. There is a particular ache to a main street where half the storefronts are boarded, to an arena with no children on the ice, to a school with grass growing through the cracks in the playground. A house is cheap because the community that once gave it meaning has drained away down the highway, and no amount of money can conjure that community back into being. People are not only buying shelter, they are buying neighbors, a school for their children, a doctor within reach, a reason for the town to exist, and in these places, that is precisely the thing that no longer comes with the house. You can buy the building for the price of a used car. You cannot buy back the life that used to fill it. Is there any future at all for the empty towns of Canada, or do they simply keep going dark one by one? The honest answer is mixed. A few of these places have flickered back toward life. Tumbler Ridge, a coal town in British Columbia that was purpose-built in 1981 and swelled to nearly 4,800 people, very nearly emptied when its main mine closed in the year 2000, and the company bought back almost every house in town. For a while, its homes sold for the price of a car, and the streets went quiet. What saved it was luck and reinvention in equal measure. Coal prices recovered, new mines opened, and geologists found the footprints and bones of dinosaurs in the surrounding hills, turning a dying mining town into a fossil destination with a global geopark designation and a population that has climbed back toward 2,400. Rising metal prices have reopened mines that everyone thought were finished, and every so often a wave of fly-in workers fills a few apartments in a town that had written itself off. Governments have tried immigration programs designed to steer newcomers toward struggling rural regions, and remote work has let a small number of people trade a city apartment for a lakeside house at a fraction of the cost. There is a genuine glimmer of hope in one direction, and it is worth naming honestly. The world's hunger for the metals that go into batteries and electric motors, the lithium and the nickel and the copper, and the rare elements of the green transition, has sent prospectors and companies back into exactly the kind of country that built these towns. Old mining districts everyone had written off are being surveyed again. In some regions, it is the indigenous communities, whose ties to this land run far deeper than any company's balance sheet, and whose populations are young and growing, where the settler towns are shrinking, who increasingly hold the rights and the future of the territory. If any lasting revival comes to the empty places, it may well come on their terms rather than the old ones. The trouble is that the fundamental arithmetic has not changed. A modern mine no longer needs a town at all. It flies its workers in for 2 weeks and flies them out again, housing them in a camp of trailers beside the airstrip, generating a fortune and a few hundred jobs without ever creating a single new family, a single new school, or a single house that needs buying. The wealth still flows out of these regions. The people no longer have to. This is why the cheap houses in the old towns stay cheap and stay empty even in the middle of a mining boom, because the boom no longer needs them. Immigration programs bring newcomers who often leave within a year or two once the second winter arrives and the nearest emergency room is still 3 hours away on an icy road. Remote work sounded for a moment like the answer, until people remembered that the internet is exactly the thing these places most lack, and that the isolation which looks romantic on a summer weekend becomes something much heavier in the dark of February. A trickle of people have made it work and love the lives they have built. They remain a trickle. Drive the empty roads that lead to these towns at the end of a long day, and you feel the size of the country settle into your bones. The light stretches gold and thin across the water, or the muskeg, and the shadows reach all the way across the cracked pavement. A rusted headframe stands against the sky, where a shift change once emptied 1,000 men into the street. A furnished house sits locked at the edge of a clearing, with its curtains still hanging, waiting for a family that will never turn back up the drive. Somewhere, a streetlight switches on over a road that no longer goes anywhere, and the wind moves down a main street past boarded windows, the way it has moved for 30 or 50 or 90 years, with no one left to hear it. These towns gave the country its coal and its copper, its gold and its iron, its newsprint and its cod, and asked in return only that someone might stay and remember. The houses are cheap because memory, in the end, is cheap. And the wind is the only thing that still travels freely down most of these streets. Look after yourselves out there, wherever you are watching from, and spare a thought, tonight, for the empty towns of Canada, going quietly dark beneath a sky far too vast for the few who remain.